Welcome to Networking RX, a podcast devoted to helping business professionals like you enhance your networking skills in order to become more proficient giving and receiving quality business referrals and improving the overall quality of your life and the lives of those around you. The Networking RX podcast is a production of AmSpirit Business Connections, an organization whose mission is to empower business success through networking.
Welcome back for another episode. This is Frank Agin, founder and president of AmSpirit Business Connections, and you are listening to the Networking RX podcast. Today, we are going to review some material that we talked about in the past and then talk about some new material. On March 3rd, I shared a story, I shared information about the Imposter Syndrome. It was episode 154. In that program, I talked about an article that I had read that was written by Kay Coughlin, and in her article, she talked about the Imposter Syndrome. And what the Imposter Syndrome is more or less us, me, you, others, feeling as if we don't measure up, looking around and just kind of questioning whether we belong where we belong. Geez, how did I get into this college? Do I really belong? Was it a mistake? Maybe they're going to find this out, or I got this job. Do they realize that I'm not qualified for this, or I don't feel qualified for this? And there's a surprisingly large percentage of people who have this feeling. A surprisingly large percentage of people. Even people at Harvard have this feeling. Professors at Harvard have this feeling. Not everybody, but a lot of people have this imposter syndrome type feeling. In that same episode, again, episode 154, which was released on March 3rd of 2020, in that same episode, I reviewed another article that I had stumbled across by John Millen, who is a communications consultant, leadership consultant. And John talked about the imposter syndrome as well. In fact, he referenced some of the same material that Kay had referenced. But in his article, and we talked about these, there were 5 or 6 different things that he had suggested to help overcome imposter syndrome. And again, the imposter syndrome is just a sensation that we feel like a fraud, like we don't belong. And in John's article, he provided several ideas for overcoming imposter syndrome. The first was, and I just kind of referenced it already, remember you're not alone. And he basically says that 70% of the people feel like they're a fraud. Stop comparing yourself was another one. Express your fears. Suspend judgment. Don't judge yourself so hard. Shift your mindset. And the last thing he talked about was fake it till you make it. I don't want to get into a lot of detail. You can go back and listen to episode 154 and kind of really delve into it. But what I did want to share is I ran across an article. It was actually in Psychology Today. It was in the January-February issue of Psychology Today. I'm a little behind on my reading, but that's going to happen. I read a lot and have lots of things coming at me. But there was a study that was done, and the study was, the lead researcher was Richard Gardner at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas, UNLV, the Running Rebels. I guess if you're not a sports fan, that means absolutely nothing to you, but that's neither here nor there. But in the study, what they did was they had approximately 100 or more participants, 113 it says in here, and they were all in what they call a rigorous undergraduate program for accounting and finance, and they kind of had them in 2 groups. And the one group, they had the accounting finance people basically hanging out with other accounting and finance people, and then they had another group of people that they had hanging out with just I don't want to say normal people, but it was kind of a mix of people. You had people from chemistry, you had people from biology, communication, the arts, history, things like that. And so they were kind of in more of a diverse setting. And what they did then is they came back and asked questions of the people, do you agree? The questions were, do you agree or not agree with certain statements? And one of the statements, for example, was, sometimes I'm afraid others will discover how much knowledge or ability I really lack. Now that statement, and I'm sure there were many others within the questionnaire, just for it to have scientific significance, that statement in particular lends itself to imposter syndrome. Sometimes I'm afraid others will discover how much knowledge or ability I really lack. And I shared in episode 154 my own sensation of imposter syndrome. And I go through bouts here and there. I think everybody goes through bouts of feeling like they don't belong or they're a fraud. And I think we need to try and work to get through this, especially from a networking standpoint, because feeling like you're a fraud or like you don't belong may be the very reason why you don't walk through the door of that so-called networking event, whatever that networking event might be. Maybe it's a trade association type event, or maybe it's a true networking event, whatever it might be. A community organization, serving on a board because you don't feel you belong, and the things that hold us back from those things are this imposter syndrome. So to the extent we can kind of put that imposter syndrome behind us, the better off we're going to be. But I shared my own feelings about it when I was working as a tax consultant in public accounting. There were a lot of times, many times, that I felt like, oh my God, I don't belong. These people are so smart. And in looking back at it, I kind of realized, and in looking and thinking about this study, what was going on. I'm hanging out with some really bright people who studied taxes continually, taxes and accounting, financial accounting standards boards, FASBs, things like that. They were just mired down in that. And while I could probably keep up with someone, I couldn't keep up with everybody. And so you start comparing yourself to the whole room, and you're realizing that, geez, this massive knowledge that's sitting around in the office, well, quite simply, I don't measure up. I don't measure up to everybody. I can measure up to individuals, but when you start thinking about everybody, all the people in the accounting finance program, all the people in this tax department, all the people who are where you're at, you can't keep up with everyone. The collective body is always going to be smarter than you. That's plain and simple. Essentially, this gets back to the whole notion of the wisdom of crowds. And what they've done is they've done studies where there was a study that was done around the turn of the century at a fair, and they had individuals guess how much a prize oxen weighed. And they had, hundreds of people guessing, a couple thousand people guessing, and nobody guessed it correctly. Nobody guessed it correctly, but collectively as a group, they were within a few tenths of a pound of this big 2,000-pound beast. And so that's the whole notion of wisdom of crowds, is that a whole group has much more knowledge than any individual. So me standing in a tax department looking at the whole department, I'm going to feel like, geez, I don't belong. I don't know as much as this whole room does. But if I would start and talk to any individual, I would probably be able to measure up with many of those people. So, but in those moments, you don't realize that. You're kind of stuck in it and like, oh my gosh, I'm an imposter. And so anyhow, what this study says is to help alleviate yourself from the imposter syndrome, hang out with non-professional peers from time to time. I mean, if you're a realtor and you live in that realtor world and you go to that real estate office every day and you're talking with that whole room of people who deals with all sorts of different experiences, you're likely going to feel like you don't measure up, like, my gosh, I don't have that experience. And yes, you are not smarter than the collection of the people in the room, but individually you do measure up. The other thing is when you get outside of that room, you become the expert. When you're a realtor and you're dealing with your clients, you are the expert. It reminds me of something that happened years ago in an AmSpirit Business Connection meeting. And for those who are familiar with those organizations, you know how the meetings go. For those who are not, there's a point in the meeting where everyone has the opportunity to take a turn and talk about what would be a good referral for them, who they'd like to meet, something, what would help them. And it generally goes, good referral for me is whatever. Well, there was a particular member in the chapter. He was an attorney, and he was more of a litigator, but he was in a larger firm. But he stood up and he said, "Well, just kind of breaking with tradition here, breaking with what I normally say. A good referral for me might be somebody that who needs estate planning done." And he didn't stop there. He kept going on. He said, "I don't do a lot of that, but there are people in the office that I can bounce questions off of, I'm just trying to learn. I would probably cut my fee because I'm really trying to learn. He kind of kept hedging and really kind of peeling away, discrediting himself more or less. And he went through and finished what he had to say, and he sat down, and the meeting ended. And I talked to him after the meeting. Now, for those who don't know, I used to be an attorney, so I have that background. And I pulled him aside and I said, "Why did you do that? Why did you say anything that, hedging about who you are, and kind of revealing that you might not have this expertise? Stop and think for a minute. You are the expert in this room. You may not feel like you know enough about estate planning or not comfortable with what you know, but you know more about estate planning than anybody sitting in this room, including me, because it had been years since I had practiced law. But obviously it was kind of this imposter syndrome. It's like, I just feel like I have to just qualify or disqualify myself in some form or fashion. And in a way, it kind of hurt him, because nobody's going to be handy. Hey, here's my best client. Cut your teeth on this guy. So the point in this is, yeah. And again, getting back to episode 154, we all from time to time suffer from the imposter syndrome. Most people do. And if someone says they never have, they're probably lying about it. We all kind of suffer from this imposter syndrome, but there are ways of combating it, and I went through a number of them in episode 154, but here's just another way for you to deal with it: is be sure to hang out with people who don't do what you do, family, friends, professionals who are not in your industry, and at the same time realize that you really are the expert. When you walk into most networking events, you're the expert at what you do. You know more about the law than anybody standing there, or real estate. Now, there might be individuals in there who do what you do, but still, you're on par with them. You're not smarter. If you're an attorney, you're not smarter than the whole law firm that you're in. But individually, you do measure up. And so, keep that in mind. Don't let the imposter syndrome keep you away from joining that board, being involved with the organization, doing whatever it is, networking with people, because if you do, it's really kind of a disservice to yourself. In closing, if you know of an entrepreneur, business owner, or professional that seems to enjoy networking, they appear well connected and are somewhat involved with, let's say, a chamber or a professional networking organization, they would be a good person for me to meet. As you know, being networked is vital to success, and receiving referrals is probably it is the most effective means of generating business. So if you know such a business professional, work into the conversation a question like this, somewhat rhetorical, but ask them if you had a choice, would you rather be a renter or the person who owns the building? Now, they'll probably chuckle at the question and indicate that somehow they'd obviously like to own the building rather than being the schmuck who pays rent. When they do, indicate that you're familiar with the franchise opportunity through AmSpirit Business Connections, where they're not just paying to be part of a professional networking group, but rather they're instrumental in building that professional networking group and profiting from them. You can start multiple groups. From there, suggest that they contact me using the email we provide at the end of the podcast, or the one we have in the show notes. Or better yet, take that email them, and include me on that message connecting the two of us, and I can take it from there. I would certainly appreciate that.
Thanks for joining us on the Networking RX podcast. Please put what you've learned into action today, and let us know if you have questions, comments, or ideas for future topics. You can email them to us at podcast@amspirit.com. That's AMSPIRIT.com. Finally, so you never miss an episode, be sure to subscribe to the Networking RX podcast through iTunes, Overcast, or however you receive your podcasts. Now get out and network with someone.
The Networking RX podcast is the copyright production of AmSpirit Business Connections. All rights reserved.